Have you ever been so mad at somebody that you telekinetically threw a running lawnmower at them? Well, in today's video, we're going to talk about that, and about how getting woke to how abused you've been your whole life isn't all it's cracked up to be. Let's get to it, shall we?
All you'll ever be.
For obvious reasons, humanity has always been fascinated by the subject of intelligence. And since antiquity, one of the oldest storytelling archetypes has involved a human gaining too much knowledge with disastrous results. Whether we're talking about Prometheus being punished by the gods for stealing fire, or Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge and causing the fall of man, it's a common sociological fear that intelligence comes with a trade-off, a dark side all too easily overlooked. Science fiction has, since its inception, also dabbled in the subject, from Frankenstein's monster burdened with sophisticated learning, to Dr. Moreau gifting the animal kingdom with all the horror of bestial self-awareness. The 1950s saw the publication of Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes, a short story, and later novel, in which a mentally challenged man is given increased intelligence, only to realize how horribly people have been treating him. The idea has been a common sci-fi trope ever since, featured in books, film, and TV, but in the early 1990s, one movie, ostensibly based on a short story about a deadly piece of lawn equipment, but really having more in common with Flowers for Algernon, would use that trope to explore a new and exciting technology that was at the very start of its infancy: virtual reality.
Job Smith is a simple, hard-working man with the mind of a child. When the scientist Dr. Lawrence Angelo falls on hard times with his experiments into virtual reality and human intelligence, he sees Job as a potential test subject, someone he can mold to be smarter and more capable of fitting in with a society that mistreats him. Job progresses faster than Dr. Angelo's wildest dreams, but when the Doctor's corporate overlords start tampering with his work and Job begins displaying unexpected superhuman powers, things quickly escalate into murder.
In 1975, famed horror writer Stephen King published the short story The Lawnmower Man, a weird little tale about a killer lawnmower and a pan-worshipping stranger who liked to crawl around naked behind it, chomping on the grass. For the next decade and a half, the movie rights changed hands several times and were planned to be used as part of multiple anthology films. In the late 80s, the rights were acquired by the production company Allied Vision, which planned to make a full-length horror movie out of the story on a budget of roughly $1.5 million. However, stretching the story out to a 90-page screenplay proved all but impossible, so the project languished in development hell. Meanwhile, the husband and wife filmmaking duo of Brett Leonard and Jamil Everett, whose only previous work was 1989's The Dead Pit, had been spending time in Silicon Valley and were introduced to the concept of virtual reality by industry pioneer Jaron Lanier, who actually coined the term. Leonard and Everett developed a movie idea they called CyberGod, so when producers at Allied contacted them to do The Lawnmower Man, somebody, it's unclear who exactly, had the idea to combine CyberGod with The Lawnmower Man. Leonard had to do a full 20-minute presentation to explain to executive producers what virtual reality even was, because at that point in history, it was a new technology not widely known. With Stephen King's name slapped onto the project and assurances from Leonard and Everett that they'd have no problem with the special effects, Allied Vision was willing to go ahead, this time on a budget of between $5 and $6 million. With Leonard directing, Everett producing, and both working on the script, CyberGod was transformed into The Lawnmower Man. While a pair of scenes do take a lot from King's story, and while some plot elements such as the evil quasi-government corporation The Shop are taken from King's other works...
Is this experiment being done by The Shop?
No.
Absolutely not.
Stephen King would later sue both Allied Vision and distributor New Line Cinema to have his name removed from the film. He was the first writer in 60 years to succeed in such a lawsuit.
Hey, do you have a sci-fi classic you want me to cover? Drop it down in the comments below, and while you're there, don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you'd like to support what I do even more, please consider joining my Patreon to get access to bonus content, vote on future topics, and more. If you still haven't gotten enough of me, I'm also the co-host of a couple of different podcasts, The Streaming Heap and From Here to Paternity, which are available wherever you get your podcasts, and I have a novel called Paradox that is available through Amazon. If all else fails, though, you can always check out my website at emcgill.com, where you'll find written reviews of plenty more science fiction classics in both film and literature. Now then, with all that shameless self-promotion out of the way, let's move on.
Given the film's relatively low budget, they couldn't afford any really big actors, but they knew they needed a high-profile name in the lead role of Dr. Angelo, the film's Frankenstein-esque mad scientist. After considering several actors including Brad Dourif, they eventually settled on Pierce Brosnan. At this point in his career, Brosnan was still seen as a television actor, not a movie star, as he was still a couple of years from being cast as James Bond. Okay, technically speaking, he had been cast as Bond before, but it had to drop out due to scheduling conflicts with Remington Steele, which is how Timothy Dalton got the role, and yada yada yada. Stop being pedantic. For the Lawnmower Man, Brosnan is more than just a pretty face, however, as he brings a complexity to Dr. Angelo that makes what could easily be an unlikable hero a lot more sympathetic. For the character of Job, they needed someone who could believably turn from warm and mentally handicapped to intelligent and hopelessly megalomaniacal. As such, they cast Jeff Fahey, a character actor whose previous work included Psycho 3 and Body Parts, and who would later star as Frank Lapidus in the TV series Lost.
We're not going to Guam, are we?
Fellow Lost co-star Doug Hutchinson, who plays Horace Goodspeed, also auditioned for Job and was given a small role in The Lawnmower Man as this technician. Other notable actors include Near Dark and The Wall actress Jenny Wright as Marnie,
This is bigger than our whole apartment.
the I Know That Guy character actors Jeffrey Lewis and Troy Evans as Job's boss Terry and the police officer Lieutenant Goodwin, respectively, Jeremy Slate as Father McKean, Dean Norris as the director, and future Last Action Hero star Austin O'Brien in his feature film debut as Peter. Filming began in late May of 1991, with location shooting taking place in LA, Simi Valley, and southern Pasadena, including at the Church of the Angels, the Ambassador Hotel in LA, and at the Brandeis Institute. Many of the sets were constructed with brutalist architecture and fluorescent lighting, also a ton of black lights for the main laboratory set, which not only gave the movie a literal underground feel, but also had the benefit of being relatively inexpensive. The body harnesses used in the film, the gyrospheres, really did work, though they were reportedly painful, given that the only connection point was at the hips, and hot, since the actors were wearing lycra suits under hot stage lights in the summer heat of Southern California. Still, Brosnan and Fahey did their own stunts in the gyrospheres, though Jenny Wright couldn't overcome intense vertigo and was replaced in wide shots with a stunt double. The film's biggest concern was its heavy reliance on computer graphics. Given the film's small budget, most insiders considered the idea of doing so many CGI sequences in a feature film impossible. For reference, Terminator 2 was being put together at the same time, and it actually has less CG in it, despite the benefit of having ILM and a roughly $100 million budget. The only good news for The Lawnmower Man was that the computer graphics were supposed to look non-photorealistic. They were supposed to look more like CG art. Nevertheless, nobody wanted the job of effects supervisor, so Leonard and Everett had to take on that role themselves. Given that they knew the right people, they were able to turn to Angel Studios, an effects house out of San Diego that had done some work on television commercials, and also Chaos Inc., a software-driven effects company. Angel Studios did most of the fluid, three-dimensional shots, some of which would later be repurposed for the CG showcase film Beyond the Mind's Eye, the second in a series of 4 movies I watched the heck out of back in the day. Chaos Inc. was responsible for other effects, like the virtual heads-up display, the floating Job head, and some really interesting artistic shots like this one. Today, Chaos Inc. is still around as a small effects house, but Angel Studios has become a big gaming company, better known as Rockstar San Diego. The major problem on The Lawnmower Man, though, was one of resolution. The same problem that had hampered so many films before it, such as The Last Starfighter and Flight of the Navigator, both previous topics on this channel. To combat this, all of the CG was rendered in NTSC resolution, television standard, and was then upscaled using something called the Gemini process, which to explain is frankly above my pay grade. Suffice it to say, the Gemini process would prove to be revolutionary for the emerging CGI film market, proving that you could make effects that would mimic high fidelity on a more shoestring budget. The Lawnmower Man released in early March 1992, to middling reviews but widespread box office success, earning $32.1 million in its initial domestic run and becoming New Line Cinema's best performing film of the year. It also made a lot of money on home video, especially after the release of a director's cut that restored several deleted scenes. Beyond that, the movie spawned a pair of video games and a sequel that was disastrous enough to kill any further franchise potential. Like most movies I cover on this channel, though, it has maintained a steady cult classic status and is fondly remembered by those of us who grew up in the 90s. Younger audiences might find it garish, problematic, and silly. But if you can look beyond the 1990s style of the film and remember that practically no one knew what virtual reality was back then, The Lawnmower Man is a groundbreaking piece of cinema, a landmark at a crossroads of culture and technology at the dawn of the internet age. It not only popularized virtual reality, changing the term from an esoteric idea from the depths of Silicon Valley into a household concept while getting surprisingly close to predicting what it would actually look like, but it also demonstrated the unhealthy relationship people could have with digital information, how absorbing too much without the wisdom of experience can radicalize us in new and terrifying ways. With that in mind, I am torn on the inclusion of the aggression drugs that lead to Job's psychotic break. Thematically, I think the story works better if Job breaks on his own, if Dr. Angelo's hubris and eagerness to prove himself, combined with information overload and a mind not predisposed to deal with it, are all that lead to the disaster. In my mind, Dr. Angelo gets off too easy, because, looked at objectively, he is as much a villain as any of Job's other abusers throughout the story. His exploitation of a mentally challenged man is not really forgivable, even if he happens to be as handsome as Pierce Brosnan. Then again, from a purely narrative perspective, I think the story does need the tainted formula to act like a catalyst, much like how 1931's Frankenstein added the idea of an abnormal brain to help sell the monster's erratic nature. There's also a very heavy religious overtone here. Job is raised by a domineering and partially sadistic priest, and he sees the world very much in twisted Christian terms, to the point that when he starts his descent into madness, he sees himself as a digital Christ figure, even concluding that in cyberspace he is God.
I am God here.
Religion isn't shown at its best in this movie, especially in the director's cut.
I will see to it personally that VSI makes a large contribution to the church.
Tithing is a blessed act.
But it also doesn't go so far as to feel unrealistic. Under the wrong conditions, religion can be a sort of madness in and of itself, and it is shown very clearly in the film that Father McKean, rather than being an avatar for Christian charity, is an abusive figure drunk on his own sense of power over the relatively helpless Job. This, in turn, gives Job a warped idea of what it means to have power, so that when he does try to assume godlike status, he does it in order to dominate and control, to remake the world in his image, not out of an altruistic desire to help his fellow man. So while it is easy to say The Lawnmower Man is just an early 90s cyberpunk version of Flowers for Algernon, I think that might be a bit too reductive. There's a lot to chew on in this prescient sci-fi fairy tale, and even outside the story, the movie is a good, entertaining ride on its own merits, not to mention its importance in visual effects. And so The Lawnmower Man remains, in the final analysis, a sci-fi classic. And that's all for today, my fellow Earthlings. If you could use technology to get super smart, would you? Let me know in the comments, and while you're there, don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons. Thank you for watching, and until next time, when we'll get under the skin of a hypochondriac, this is the Unapologetic Geek, telling you to never be ashamed of what you love. As long as you're not hurting anybody.
Hell of a thing. Hell of a thing.